CPE credit for this program. And if you intend to earn CPE, please note that we're using polling questions throughout the session. They'll be conducted at 3 points during the session, and you have to attend for at least 75 minutes to earn 1.2 CPE credits and answer at least 5 of our polling questions. You can earn 1 CPE if you just attend for 15 minutes, 50 minutes, and respond to 3 poll questions. As we go through the program today, if you have questions, please click on the Q&A link that you see on your desktop console here in Zoom and submit your questions there, and we'll be taking them at different points during the program. So with that, let me turn and I will walk through our agenda. We're going to start off today with a discussion between the SEC and our team here to talk a little bit about the rule as well as technical issues related to implementation of the rule. We'll have an introduction to XBRL for those of you who are somewhat less familiar with the standard. We will then move on to workflow and tagging demonstration, and then samples and tips. And then we will open it up to audience questions. So again, please queue up those questions by clicking on the Q&A link. Send us your questions, and we'll take them as we get towards the end of the program. So as I said, we have some really great speakers today. I just want to introduce our first speaker, Josh Ladner. Josh is CEO and co-founder of NextBRL. And Josh is going to moderate and host our session today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Josh. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Michelle, for the introduction, and thanks for having me here. As Michelle mentioned, we have a great lineup of 40 Act filer experts for you, cross-industry representation, starting with Nikki Berteau. She's the disclosure product analyst at Broadridge Financial Solutions. Then we have Michael Boyle. He's an XBRL manager at Donnelley Financial Solutions. Scott Tice, he's the CEO of NovaWorks and chair of the XBRL US Domain Steering Committee. We have Guy Stanzione. He's a compliance services director at Topan Merrill. And then last but not least, we have Jacob Sandoval. He's a senior specialist accountant with the SEC in the Division of Investment Management, Disclosure Review, and Accounting Office. So without further ado, let's jump into our agenda, beginning with the Tailored Shareholder Reporting Rule itself. We'll be going through some questions here, but we will, as Michelle mentioned, we will have a Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions that come up, feel free to drop those in, and we'll do our best to put those in at the end of the session. First off, I'd like to first off thank our SEC guest, Jacob Sandoval, for speaking today. I'll hand it over to him to introduce himself and provide some initial remarks for us.
Well, thanks, Josh, and thanks everyone for having me here. And so just to start off, we always have to give our standard disclaimer. So I'm going to start off with my remarks today are provided in my official capacity as the Commission's senior special accountant, and my views do not necessarily represent the views of the Commission, the commissioners, or other members of the staff. I'll also add another secondary disclaimer in that you'll hear me use the terms XBRL or iXBRL interchangeably. So don't come at me if you hear me say XBRL as shorthand, like during this conversation.
We'll be sure to have the counter up there, Jacob. All right. So let's get in. We have 2 series of questions here that I'm going to fire at you. And a lot of these questions were crowdsourced from XBRL US members, so appreciate everyone for being involved with it. First set of questions will be really about the rule. The second set of questions will be a little bit more technical and tactical about the implementation of it. Starting with our first question here, Jacob. So what was the motivation behind establishing this rule, and what were the issues that the SEC hoped to improve upon with it?
Great, thanks for the question. I really like this question because it's always important to look back as to the reason behind the rule and the goals of the Commission in its adoption. Now, to many on this webinar, you might think that the current rulemaking pace is pretty quick, but for this rule, it was years in the making. Actually, most rules are years in the making, but this one in particular, it's interesting because in 2018, the Commission put out a request for comment on fund investor experience and disclosures. And so the Commission heard feedback from investors and the industry that disclosures were cumbersome and lengthy. And so the Commission heard this feedback, and started out with an RFC in 2018, seeking comment to learn how investors use the disclosures, how funds can improve upon disclosures, how investors are using them to make investment decisions. And so we sought input on the design, the delivery, the content of fund disclosures. Now, this was back in 2018. In fact, actually, it goes even back further in 2011 and 2012, where there was investor testing on shareholder reports and a study on financial literacy. And so if you look in history, from these surveys and studies and this RFC, you start to see kind of the start of the proposal. It essentially comes out in 2020, and then with the adopting release in 2022. And so you asked about motivation, and I just want to highlight that the rulemaking is largely driven, for this one in particular, is from investor feedback, and so from industry feedback. And so for this sort of need for modernized, simplified, and like layered disclosure, the commission simply guided all of that feedback over time into this rule. And so it might be partially why, if you look at some of this rule and how it was adopted, it was voted on unanimously by the commissioners. And so that doesn't happen as often. So you can start to see, and I think that there's several, I guess, articles out there around just kind of this goal ultimately for kind of clear, concise disclosure for investors. That's something that we all want. And for me, that's a strong motivator for this rule, and probably for folks on this webinar today, like ultimately want investors to get kind of digestible information in their disclosures. Now, you mentioned issues. There are a lot of issues out there, but this is one where we wanted to tackle because it relates to really shareholder understanding, modernizing our framework, including this layered approach. And you hear this term, layered approach, and you see that actually in rulemakings or in speeches. And I just wanted to highlight that it's important to understand where we're at today, and how much information is coming at investors and how we really want to digest it. So in my role, I've seen thousands of annual reports. Some are more complicated than others. I do this for a living, so I can only imagine how an investor would digest thousands of pages of an annual report. And so, for example, there's one filer out there whose single annual report is over 10,400 pages long. And so I've seen it printed, and it looks like a phone book. It's straight up like a phone book. Actually, now that I think about it, maybe folks on the call might be too young, and so they may not know what a phone book looks like. But essentially, it's really thick. I might have to change my talking points in the future. And then for the technical folks, I mean, this one filer, the one annual report, is several hundred megabytes large, and so it's a massive file. So imagine with this rulemaking that you're able to condense all of those thousands of pages into 3 to 4 page document. It's digestible, has formats such as tables, graphs, charts. So that's really the issue that we're solving with this layered approach. And the layered approach to disclosures is important to investors. It provides the key information to investors, and more detailed information is provided online or elsewhere. And so it's intended to provide investors a better ability to choose the amount and type of information for their review. This has been an approach for several rulemakings, and this one in particular, I just wanted to highlight. Now to close, I'll just say that these reports are really designed to highlight that key information, and it's important for retail investors. So that's essentially the motivation behind it, and then just kind of the issue that we're trying to solve, Josh.
Oh, that makes sense. And as a user of this information, I appreciate it too. So thank you. Great. All right. Next question. What are the key elements of the rule that funds should be aware of as they begin preparing to comply?
Key elements of the rule. I feel like, because this is XBRL US, I feel like my default should be that XBRL is the sole key element. But that's not what I'm saying. That's one of the key elements, but there are several. And so I just wanted to highlight just kind of some key points of the rule. And I'm going to focus really on just kind of the shareholder report itself, because the content is pretty important, because what's in the content is what's actually tagged. So some of the information was retained. So if you look at the old requirements in 1A, and then the new requirements through the Tailored Shareholder Report, some items were retained. And so MDFP has been retained, the current expense example, geographical representation of holdings, changes in disagreements with accountants. In fact, actually in the rule, if you all get a chance that are on the call, one thing that's super helpful is there's a table that basically shows what was, previous under the rule, and then what's been retained or changed. And so one element in the management discussion of fund performance, or MDFP, that's been retained is essentially a performance line graph. And one thing that did change is the definition of an appropriate broad-based securities market index. And so it was adopted as proposed. And so it's an index that represents the overall applicable domestic and international equity and debt markets as appropriate. And so while the presentation of an appropriate broad-based market index is required in the performance line graph, the final rule does allow for the inclusion of more narrowly defined indexes to reflect market segments in which the fund invests. So I wanted to highlight that change in particular because we did get a lot of questions around the definition of an appropriate broad-based securities market index. And so it's just something I did want to point out. And so if you are all vendors or working with this, it's an area where you can add value in a way to registrants into highlighting that this is, the term did change. We might see questions around it. We might see indices change with the shareholder reports. And it's also, this is how important it is. It's the first two questions of the TSR FAQs that are posted on the SEC's website. And so there are TSR, so Tailored Shareholder Report FAQs, frequently asked questions. Those were posted in January of 2024. And so some other elements, those were the ones that retained. And then some elements that are new is we look at some additions. And so fund statistics disclosure, and this one's important because, again, it deals with XBRL, taxonomy. There are net assets were added, or total number of portfolio holdings, portfolio turnover rate, total advisory fee. And so these are additional items that have been added, but then it also permits a fund to disclose even more statistics that registrants will feel that are helpful to investors to understand the fund's operations and activities. And so there's also data related to material changes. And so if there are material changes such as the change in fund name, fund objective, principal risk, there's a few items that are outlined within the rule. And so it clarified that the final release from proposal to adoption highlighted that there may be other elements too that would need to highlight in a material change. It also clarifies that some items on the list, it may be required to be disclosed when it's material. And it doesn't mean that every change is automatically material. The fund should evaluate the facts and circumstances surrounding the change and to determine whether or not that there was a change that's material that would need to be disclosed. And so some items that were removed. So one item that's no longer in the shareholder report and it's been eliminated from NCSR is the liquidity risk management statement. So there's previously a statement about the liquidity risk management program. So with the adoption of the Tailored Shareholder Report, that drops off. So it's one of the changes. And then again, one of the key elements, and this is super important, is XBRL. Because if you think about it, there are going to be thousands of shareholder reports. So if you think about every fund and then every essentially share class, you will have a Tailored Shareholder Report. You'll see lots of data and then these elements that are within that report to be tagged. And so its important focus is the XBRL. And if you think about it, there's limited manpower everywhere. And so you'd think that, generally we use a lot of data when we sort of evaluate errors, risks, and those matters. So we will be using the XBRL. And I think that we'll probably get into that a little bit later.
Yeah, I know Michael and Guy will be getting into the details, into the weeds there too. But I mean, I kind of look at it, right? Like you're going to buy a house and you know how many rooms there are, and it's almost like you guys are saying, okay, here's how big each rooms are. Each of the rooms are. You're giving a little bit more detail and digging a little deeper into it. So makes sense.
That's right.
All right. Well, Jacob, so next one, and we will hold you accountable to inline versus XBRL on this question. So why did the SEC opt for inline XBRL for TSRs? Are there specific benefits you see in requiring inline XBRL for TSRs for shareholders or other stakeholders using the data?
Yeah, sure. And I'll make the distinction, I guess, between inline and XBRL. And it's nice actually to go back in time. So in 2009, the commission adopted rules requiring operating company financial statements and mutual fund risk and return summaries to be submitted in XBRL. Now, it was a little bit cumbersome because you'd have a separate XBRL exhibit, attached to that filing. And so in 2018, the commission actually adopted modifications to these requirements, requiring issuers to use inline XBRL to reduce the time and effort associated with preparing XBRL filings and to improve the quality and usability of the XBRL data. And so as a data protection practitioner and reviewer myself, I will say that it's easier. using inline. And so when I'm looking at funds for review, it's easier for me to filter, besides handling that separate exhibit when I'm doing reviews. And so, it's inline is definitely more beneficial in that way. And so inline XBRL does allow for retail investors or other market participants to use automated analytical tools to extract the information. No matter where it's located, you can essentially aggregate that pretty quickly. And one thing I would point out as far as the benefits go, the commission has highlighted several benefits of inline. And so in the adopting release, inline XBRL technology, a few benefits that were highlighted were that it was expected to reduce over time the XBRL preparation time, the effort by eliminating duplication or facilitating reviews of XBRL data. The release also highlights it gives preparer full control over the presentation of XBRL disclosures within an HTML filing. It was expected to reduce the likelihood of inconsistencies between the HTML document and the XBRL filing itself, improving the quality of that data, and then enhancing the usability of structured disclosures for investors. Again, like me as a user, it's definitely much easier to kind of view it on the websites, for example. And so there are other benefits, but if you want to really kind of highlight some of the benefits of inline, if your registrants or clients have questions on some of the benefits, definitely look at the releases, because a lot of research and comments have came into this around inline XBRL. And so it's something that you can leverage as data vendors when you're explaining this to some of your clients or registrants as well.
Great. No, I do appreciate the visuals too. When you are going through it, it helps both. I mean, with XBRL, needing to fulfill two things, the human readable and machine readable, it really kind of connects those two.
Yeah.
As well. So, all right. So Jacob, how do you expect data generated in structured format from TSRs to be used? And additionally, how do you guys use it at the SEC, or what do you plan on using it for?
Yeah, so I really like this question. I think we get it a lot with any of our data sets. So just for everyone on the call, like, investment companies provide a lot of data. You have NPORT, you have NSEN, you have other data elements through XBRL, through risk and return summaries. Closed-end funds also are reporting. You have BDCs that are reporting currently on their financial statements, XBRL. So a lot of data coming in. And this is kind of exciting for us because effectively it's like a blank canvas in a way. Think about it. Like, there's a lot of data here that is in a structured format. And so and it's important to investors. We went through an entire rulemaking determining that this information is kind of critical for investors. And so you can imagine, if you just kind of step back and you think, okay, well, how would I utilize this data? If I was looking for risks, if I was looking for compliance issues, how might I be able to leverage this data in mass? Again, like I said, those thousands of shareholder reports, you can look at it in mass, you can look at their tagging, you can evaluate across, and you can kind of see changes over time. And so I would expect the data generated is going to be used. I will say that we do utilize data considerably. And so personally, I'm even like looking forward to when the first filings come in to really evaluate what's out there. How we'll use it internally, it's no secret. We utilize data. We utilize it to identify issues, to identify risks. I do intend that we will be utilizing this as part of various reviews that we have. And so, like, no different than we use NPORT or NSEN or other data sets, it unlocks essentially a new element to us to be able to leverage to really, evaluate and protect investors at the end of the day, and also monitor, what's happening in the market, because there is some ancillary data in there that could be very helpful in the broad terms for kind of evaluating funds. And so, yeah, that hopefully gives you a little bit as to kind of how we might think about this data.
No, thank you for that. Yeah, it definitely helps. When you're providing things to someone or organization, or how are they using it? What are they looking at? What are their key metrics that they care about? So very helpful. Thank you. All right, so we'll move along to the more technical or tactical questions here. So the first couple of questions here, Jacob, are around really your thoughts on how to avoid potential filing errors. We all want to be proactive and avoid them. So first off here, bear with me on this one. So I'll ask the question, you can take it back. So fund companies often use fund administrators to support TSR creation, which now includes XBRL tagging. Large funds may use more than one fund administrator, though. So this would result in an NCSR filing that contains funds supported by multiple fund administrators. With XBRL requirements, this could now lead to a situation where fund administrators from different companies may be required to work together because of three separate things. One, an XBRL filing can only contain one HTML file, one schema, and one set of link bases. Two, all of the TSRs must be assembled into a single HTML file to avoid XBRL errors. And three, to avoid creating duplicate hidden tags. Again, we'll get into hidden tags in a little bit to represent facts on charts. An example of that being, growth of $10,000 year over year. Now the question, does the SEC have any suggestions or recommendations to filers and fund administrators to reduce the potential for error in scenarios like this?
Thanks. That definitely was a mouthful.
Yeah.
No, it's yeah. Whoever created that one, I think, took a lot of time to kind of put it all together.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a good question. I mean, for investment companies, if you think about it, like we have, our industry is a little bit unique in a way where you can have one registrant, you can have a bunch of different series in there, and then each series has multiple share classes. You could have different administrators. So I could see how it could be kind of cumbersome. I mean, ultimately, a lot of this is going to come down to communication. And so looking and communicating amongst your different vendors to try and make sure that information is being tagged appropriately. And so leveraging resources. And so some vendors or some administrators may have certain information around just kind of how they're tagging or evaluating the sample files that are in the guides. And so we do have sample files that don't provide legal guidance, but it does demonstrate just kind of proper use of tags and dimensions. And so it's really kind of communication. So how your administrators are communicating across, across the registrant. And then ultimately, there would be sort of secondary checks. And I will say that internal consistency is something that's pretty easy to check on our side too. And so usually what we could see is like we can evaluate, and we've done this before. There are ADIs out there where essentially we've highlighted instances where we've caught sort of issues in tagging or tagging errors. And it is something that we're focused on as well, as far as like looking for custom tags when someone is not using a standardized tag, like those kind of checks, like we could do. But we also expect filers to be doing that, those kind of internal consistency checks. So a lot of it's going to be communication, secondary quality checks, ensuring internal consistency. The biggest one is communication amongst your administrators, making sure that everyone is just kind of aware of kind of where they're at in the process. And also one thing that I did want to, as we were kind of prepping for this, I did want to channel the knowledge base that we have in the DERA group. And so our Division of Economic Risk Analysis, and those are the experts as far as tagging goes. They deal with a lot of the taxonomy. And one thing that they pointed out is that EDGAR supports modules and segments. And so XBRL files may be type 2 modules. It's stated, and this is in the EDGAR Filer Manual, Volume 2, version 70, and it's section 6.2. But essentially, when you're assembling into a single file, you could use essentially the guidance that's in the manual itself. And so what they pointed out there was the EDGAR filing manual. And again, you can always reach out to DERA if you do have any questions on particular how to set that up. But that's one element on just kind of how it's highlighted. So there's a couple of tools in sort of that toolbox, but honestly, a lot of it's going to come down to communication, particularly like when you have different administrators that are trying to get it all together to be able to file.
All right, that's helpful. No, thank you for that. But yeah, I agree. A lot of this has a communication aspect to it, right? So thank you for that. All right. Going on to the second question around potential filing errors and your thoughts on how to avoid them. So fund companies, even when using a single fund administrator, will likely have the need to support multiple TSRs within a single NCSR filing. This scenario could also result in errors similar to what we were just talking about. But similar to the last question, above and beyond communication, if you have anything else, does the SEC have any recommendations on how to avoid these errors in these types of scenarios?
Yeah, just I'm checking on time because I know that we got to go through a lot of panelists. But the one thing that I would just highlight is that one thing from some of our DERA folks that we've seen and observed in practice was when preparing these XBRL documents to leverage, templates or parameters to help generate that data so that it's all filed correctly. So avoid just sort of manually tagging a document when it's prepared because essentially what you have is a lot of different filings coming together. And so you really want to just make sure that, you're using appropriate templates and communication within your internal team. And the bigger thing is just kind of the secondary checks on the back end. Just making sure that it's appropriate before you file, and that'll catch a lot of those errors. It's just kind of the coming up with essentially like which ones probably should be tagged, or are you doing it consistently? And when we check a lot of it, like I said, that largely we focus on the custom tags. We've done that with the closed-end funds, and so if those folks on this call, like closed-end funds, are also tagging currently some of their annual reports and certain items that are in N2 that are noted. And a lot of what we've caught is use of custom tags or incorrect standard tags. And so one quick check for your team would be just to kind of go over the manual, so the final taxonomy, and just those items where there is a standard tag. Because one of the issues that we have is data quality, and it's largely around to using the incorrect tag or custom tags.
All right, that makes sense. Okay. And I do believe we need to move a little bit on time here. Last couple of questions here. Does the SEC have timing for the availability of the final taxonomy?
So that was actually released in March of 2024. So this is an easy question. It's out there. If you need a link or anyone needs a link, you can always reach out, but it's out there now. And so it's the Open-End Fund 2024 is published. It's the 24.1 release.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Next one, does the SEC have any further plans to educate 40 Act filers on the rationale behind the approach of using multiple taxonomies such as the US GAAP taxonomy?
So registrants can always reach out on specific questions related to the various taxonomies. As far as the rationale behind this approach, we communicate pretty regularly with the FASB. We also have our own taxonomy. This is something that's come up before, but ultimately it's not new to have multiple taxonomies. The one thing that folks can kind of consider is to use the infrastructure, XBRL infrastructure, as an entry point that assembles the necessary taxonomy. And so for those different filing types. And so that is also in the Edgar filing manual. And so it's version 60, table 6.18 that shows the correspondence between each instance type and its required optional entry points. But again, if you have any questions, in particular, those folks on the call, like, please reach out. We want this to be like an easy process because, again, data quality is super important. Like, we use this data. And so we want folks to be filing accurate data to us. And so it helps everybody. If you do have a question, you're not doing this alone, like, please reach out.
Great. Thank you, Jacob. Next question is around the use of XBRL for other 40 Act filers. Are there any plans to require this in the future? And if so, will they be required to use taxonomies, tailored to their line of business? The examples being closed-end fund taxonomies for closed-end funds, open-end fund taxonomies for open-end funds.
So I can't comment on what the SEC may or may not do. But one thing, actually, for the folks on this call, particularly if you're charged with governance or running a lot of groups or talking to a lot of your clients or registrants, is keep an eye on the RegFlex agenda. And so it highlights future rulemakings. And so one thing that I did want to point out to everybody on this call is that the RegFlex agenda that was released in the fall, it highlights that there's going to be a joint rulemaking project in response to the Financial Data Transparency Act that was signed in December of 2022. And so it's one of those rulemakings around data transparency and consistency. And essentially, the rule would establish data standards for the collection of information reported by each agency, by financial entities under their jurisdiction. And so one thing that I did want to highlight is that rule in particular really highlights the requirement of rulemaking around data transparency, quality, consistency amongst various agencies. And so you could see in the future unlocking more data sets or requiring future tagging of currently unstructured data. And so it's important to kind of think about that RegFlex agenda, the FDTA that was signed by Congress, when you're thinking about new projects or structures or even talking to registrants, because this data journey is here, and it's just kind of moving forward. And so really kind of think about how you're structuring those projects to make sure that systems are pretty easy to unlock and channel that information if in the future certain elements need to be tagged.
Great, thank you, Jacob. In the sake of time, we'll skip these last two questions. We can come back to them at the end with the Q&A if there's time. But thank you so much, Jacob, for your time today. This is truly invaluable, information, very helpful. I will hand it off to Scott Tice right now to talk about XBRL and kind of the framework and the formatting.
Well, thanks, everyone. Thank you, Josh.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob.
Thanks very much, Jacob and Josh. And just give me 1 second here to coax PowerPoint into doing its thing. There we go. So I know some of you on the call probably know a lot about XBRL, probably some don't know much about it at all. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes here to talk about what it is and give you an introduction and a way to go find more information as you learn about what you need to know for XBRL within the role that you happen to be taking on in this process. So I first wanted to talk just a little bit about what the problem is with this, not with XBRL, but the problem in general. You may notice a fair amount of gray hair. I've been involved with this thing all the way back to the Edgar pilot back in 1984. The problem is that everything was in paper. There used to be a public reading room, and everybody would congregate down there, all the press would grab stuff, and hard to index, hard to get search, etc. So in the 90s, a lot of systems started using electronic methods, and one of those was Edgar with HTML. But the content was still not easily machine identifiable. You could search for plain text, but it's hard to see exactly what that text means or exactly how that's being used. And that's where something like XBRL comes in. We're talking about inline XBRL, but XBRL is extensible business reporting language. And what inline XBRL is it basically combines HTML and XBRL. And XBRL is more than just a format. It actually does a lot of things with respect to adding meaning to the data, making the data be self-described as part of an overall data model. When you look at, for example, the TSR, there are data points that define a model as to what the SEC is looking for. When you look at GAAP, there's a data model that's just defined by the GAAP codification and by FASB, along with a lot of other taxonomies that are attached to that. So there's a lot of levels and options for validation as well. In many ways, XBRL is self-validating, and there can be extended validation added on as well. And that helps to make sure that the data quality is good when it finally gets to the destination or repository. So the data is used by a lot of people. It's used by not only the regulators, but the analysts and educational institutions and individual investors. What really makes XBRL different is the fact that it is self-describing. It's unlike CSV or JSON, which they can have a lot of extra data in those formats, but there's not any common structure for that. XBRL provides that. It also provides a taxonomy that defines what the model actually is, and that's timeless. That's going to last if you look at the stuff 50 years from now, you'll be able to understand by looking at the taxonomy and the information within it what that data point means in each document. So you'll hear the term structured data quite a bit. And XBRL is basically referred to as structured data because it is set up in a framework. So what does that mean when we take and put everything together with a taxonomy, which we'll discuss a little bit more in a moment? We have that, and we have our existing documents in HTML. When I combine those together, we'll talk about an instance later. That can be used to analyze the document. It can be used to search the document. It can be used for a lot of different things. You can do peer review, from market to market, et cetera. So there's lots of things you can do with the data once it's in that form. So structured data provides an intelligent manner to extract data from the documents. So if I wanted to have my own analytical model, and believe me, all the analysts do, they can take that data, bring it in, and throw it into their model very easily and very quickly. So each document should ideally follow the same data model as defined by taxonomy. When it comes to the TSR entry point, that's very well defined, so it's hard to kind of go beyond the boundaries of that. So let's take a little look at where XBRL is. When I first started off with this, as a bunch of people on the call started off many years ago, it's over a decade. It was really only used by FDIC and SEC. Now it's used by a lot more people. It's used all over the world. There are different kinds of taxonomies. Some are very structured, some are very open. For example, GAAP is very open. FERC for the Federal Regulatory Agency, basically Energy Regulatory Agency, sorry, stepping on my tongue there, is more of a form-based type thing. So it's very structured in that sense. And there's NGOs that use it, and it's being used also in private industry for certain things as well. And it's all over the place internationally and continuing to be put into use. Let's take a little look at something that we might be familiar with here with the average annual total returns on a particular document. So this would be represented in HTML, and you can see it in your browser or print it out, whatever the case happens to be. When I add inline XBRL, what I'm doing is I'm quote unquote tagging or putting additional information in there that the browser will ignore. But if I'm looking at this in a viewer, I can see data. I can see details about that data. And if I have other programs that want to extract that, they can access that with very precise accuracy. It's very good, and Mike will be going through this in a little bit in more detail and showing you some of the tools with this. So let's talk about the taxonomy itself for a moment. This isn't something that you develop. This is something that's developed by the agency or whoever is governing the taxonomy. So in this case, it's the SEC. A fundamental building block of a taxonomy is the concept. It's sometimes also referred to as an element. That's how it's done in XML. But that's something like cash and cash equivalents or assets, or that is a concept, and that is further defined then. So each concept has characteristics, has a relationship with other concepts. It'll have information with respect to what type of data it can represent, what period type, what balance type. There's a lot of different things. And they can also have related documentation. And this is actually really important because it adds that level of intelligence. Between documentation and authoritative references, you then know how it's supposed to use, and in many cases, what exactly is the reason that this is being disclosed. Taxonomies then are hierarchical. I'm kind of representing this turned sideways, and I'm doing that because if you go look at a taxonomy viewer, you'll see it in a much nicer mode. But here, what we see at the top, we have the entry point. Then we'll have table after table, depending on what's been defined. Some things that might be called tables aren't actually tables. They may be having detailed data points, but they would be able to be represented in a presentation table. Each table then will have line items and perhaps have axes that are specific to that kind of table. For example, different classes would be a particular type of axes. In the line items, I would have abstracts that would group things together, and then individual line item concepts. And this is repeated over and over again. Some taxonomies are very simple, have just a couple hundred items in them. Others, like the GAAP taxonomy, has close to 20,000. So they can be very complicated. So here's the question: which one are you using for SEC filings? That's determined by the type of registrant you are and the form being filed. There's lots of different entry points. The one you're going to be using for TSR is OEFSR, or Shareholder Report. And there is a preparer's guide that helps you with this, and I'll have a reference to that later, and we'll discuss that further. And in fact, here's a little excerpt of it about the entry point. This is, I don't remember what page it is, but it's obviously section 5 about the taxonomy files themselves. And here you can see NCR files have a shareholder report that use the OEF-SR entry point. So that's an example of a reference in there. And there's a lot of information that's in these guides that can help direct you. The people who are doing the actual preparation are going to be the ones that are going to be very interested in what's in there. Some taxonomies allow extensions. GAAP is well noted for that. Companies add their own extensions onto it. Others are not. The SR taxonomy is relatively closed, only allowing the addition of dimensional data for classes, class IDs, geographic information, industry information, things like that. Part of that table, before is presentations, and the presentations actually then have a model of how the data is supposed to look. So each concept is then grouped in there, and you'll see again those data types and those abstracts. So you can actually see the structure of that data if you look at it in a tool like Yeti. Yeti is very common. Including again is the axes that can be used. So the thing that you're actually filing is called the instance. And you look, what does that term actually mean? Well, it's kind of a programming term. I think it got carried in. Basically, it's the instance, the snapshot of your data at that particular period of that particular filing. So it is the XBRL portion of the disclosure of your data, and it's going to contain context that are going to define then what period that applies to. And there are also instant in duration, but that's not too important to this discussion. And each particular concept will have which kind they can use. And that context can also contain dimensional information. For example, for this period, for this particular class, for the next class, for the next class. Those contexts are then used to help identify the data. And that data then is a fact. It's defined by that unique intersection of a context and a concept. So I'll have, for example, that table we had before would have a couple of different contexts and then a couple of different concepts, and each one of those would represent a fact showing up here. And what's highlighted in red is the information as tagged. The rest of the information here is not really of interest to XBRL. When I see XYZ sample fund class A, the reason it knows that is that the year one in here will have the class ID, the 10-digit C0009786, whatever, to identify then which class that belongs to. That's the SEC defined class number. So then what are you filing? It's different. Well, your HTML is going to be exactly the same, except now it'll be XHTML with iXBRL, and that is your instance. Depending on how you're structuring it, you'll also may have a schema, and really what that's going to do is link together which entry point you're using and any other particular information that's necessary. And that will be EX101. You'll be seeing that with a .sch. And then you can have link bases that'll vary depending on what's part of your filing. I think in the case of shareholder reports, I don't think you can define labels, so you wouldn't have a lab. So that would be the type of additional files that would go along. And you'll see those if you go on the SEC. Just go look at any 33 Act company at this point. You'll find a 10K or 10Q, and you'll be able to look at these constituent files. They are all combined together to build the interactive data. If you look at them and open them up, you're going to go, wow, your head will probably explode because it's full of a lot of technical XML stuff that nobody really wants to look at. So the key takeaways I want to leave you with today is that structured data or interactive data makes file documents much more useful to regulators and analysts. That's why we're doing this. A lot of things are moving this way, and this is just one phase that's going on, and one more that's happening. In fact, I think now this will be the fourth, I believe, for 40 Act. And then once it's set up, the tagging is not too heavily of a burden, but there's going to be, like everything that's new, a learning curve. So best to know the things that apply to your role and know them well, and get that out of the way here at the beginning, and there'll be time to do a bunch of that. And then once it's going forward, it should be pretty easy. And as a filer, then you should know those key terms and be able to talk to your service providers or anybody else that's helping you along with this, administrators, et cetera. Another person that can help you is going to be your service providers. So where can you find more information? Well, the SEC recently took a lot of the XBRL information out of the your filer manual, which is part of Reg ST, and put that in a separate guide. And this PDF will be available later and published, so you can get these links. There is a preparer's guide. I showed you just a little snippet out of that. There's the actual rule. And if you can go look at that, you can go look at the Federal Register, which combines everything together. And then there's also an FAQ that has a lot of information that's non-technical information, but it's more oriented towards the actual rule. And then finally, you can get stuff from your service provider. For example, we haven't done it for this one, but for a lot of them, we published kind of little pamphlet data points to help point to existing documents and then what points are being attached with that. So with that, I hope I tried to kind of go a little faster, hopefully, because we're running short on time. I'm going to go ahead and pass this back over to Michelle for the first set of CPE questions. And thank you very much for your time, everybody.
Great. Thanks very much, Scott. Yeah, we're going to move on, and I'm going to share my screen again here. Okay, we've got our first CPE questions. So let me bring up our polls. All right. I'm not seeing the polls come up correctly. Great. Okay, so we're just going to do 2 of these poll questions first. And I thought these would be coming up one at a time, but okay, so the first poll question, let's just go with this. The XBRL standard is required in the United States entity reporting to which of the following agencies? Which of these agencies, either US Treasury, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the Office of the Controller of the Currency, collects data in XBRL format? Okay, so you should be able to click on the link. I may need to ask a colleague to help me with this because I think we're having a bit of a problem with this poll.
Michelle, I have the polls. Would you like me to bring them up?
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Great.
Sorry about
that. First question should be on your screen.
Great.
Those of you that answered previously, please take a moment and answer the question again. Thank you.
Okay, so just like another 20 seconds for this. Then we'll move on to our second question. All right, we're going to close the poll in about 5 seconds. So please be sure to answer if you are getting CPE credit. All right, let's go ahead and close down this first poll. And the answer to that poll, just for those of you since it's not closed, is the FDIC. The FDIC requires XBRL. So David, if we can go to the second poll. All right, which of the following is a definition for an XBRL instance document? Is it 1, a schema that defines the concepts, their characteristics, and their relationships with other concepts? Or is it the collection of information that represents the XBRL disclosure of your data? Or is it the fundamental building block of the taxonomy? Which of those most accurately represents the XBRL instance document that we heard Scott talking about a few minutes ago? Okay, we have about another 15 seconds, and then we're going to go and do a third question. Okay, we're going to shut this one down. And the answer here, the correct answer, is the collection of information that represents the XBRL disclosure of your data is the instance document. So great, thank you all for answering that one. Let's go to our third poll before we move on with the presentation. The filing deadline for the NCSR is 60 days, 70 days, or 30 days. So which of these is the correct timing for the deadline? Okay, we're gonna give this about another 20 seconds. All right, but another 5 seconds. So please respond to the poll question. And then, okay, we're gonna go ahead and shut that down. And the correct timing is 70 days. Okay. So thank you for taking the polls, and we're going to move on now and move on to our next section, which is workflow and tagging demonstration. And I'm going to turn it over to Guy Stanzione. Guy, thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. So you've heard a lot of information over the course of the past 50 or so minutes. And what I'm going to look at now is the practical application of what we talked about. And then I'm going to turn it over to Mike Boyle to do a quick presentation on tagging. So when you've heard some of the information you've heard so far with a large percentage of the fund industry, choosing the fund administrators to provide TSR document creation and XBRL services, there's items that need to be considered. So Michelle, if you can move on to the next slide, please. What is the fund administrator scope of services being offered by each of the providers? We know who the large fund administrators are. Scope of services could vary between them. How do you fill in the gaps for the services not being offered by the administrator? So for instance, administrator one is doing the tagging, the creation of the TSR, the XBRL tagging, but not EGR filing. How do you fill in the gaps? Each fund administrator is offering different scope of services, as we talked about. So there's a workflow variation based on the administrator and those services provided. As Jacob said, and Jacob, thank you so much for your very detailed explanation, there needs to be communication and collaboration between the fund administrators. As he mentioned, and as one of the questions came up, there's going to be funds that are serviced by multiple fund administrators within the same NCSR filing. Based on how XBRL works, they need to be assembled into one XBRL package, whether it's a multi-class single fund filing or a multi-fund filing. The way XBRL interacts, it's got to be done in a certain way. So understanding that and what's got to be considered when you look at your XBRL. Be aware of the changes to your HTML. You saw Scott presented in a way where the HTML isn't changing, but when you look at the underlying data, things are definitely changing, especially around charts and graphs. You know, one of the aspects is called a hidden fact, and Mike's going to talk about that when he does his presentation. But a hidden fact is basically the data that's behind a chart. You don't see it in the visual presentation in your filing, but it's the data behind the chart that drives XBRL for proper presentation. And of course, we talked about there's multiple TSRs merged within a filing. When you take that into consideration, there's now added complexity to your NCSR filing. So Michelle, if you move on, thank you. So the first thing to talk about is, where are the NCSR? Boy, I apologize, folks. Where are the NCSR components coming from? So when you look at your NCSR in its current state, there's a cover. That cover currently has a sequence of information behind it. With the transition to TSR and XBRL requirement, that cover is now going to need to be assembled and XBRL tagged with the TSR or TSRs. So there's going to be an assembly and a tagging requirement for the NCSR cover. The TSRs, as Jacob talked about, need to be tagged and potentially need to be tagged using more than one taxonomy. And here we're referencing the open-end fund and the US GAAP taxonomies. There's elements within both that need to be considered, adding complexity. The rest of the NCSR, the items that we've always looked at in past filings, items 2 to 6, which the only change there is the utilization of item 6. In the past, if you use summary shareholder reports or summary schedule of investments in your document, now you also had to file the entire SOI as item 6. That is going away. The financials, The SOIs, the financial highlights, are moving into item 7 under 7A and 7B. How will they need to be merged? Adding complexity to the overall process. And then the balance of the NCSR items 8 to 18 with the corresponding exhibits, the certifications and the code of ethics for an annual report. And then more importantly, Scott talked about this, the filing format for XBRL filings is no longer HTML, it's XHTML. So how do you transform the content in your primary document from an HTML to an XHTML format, leaving the exhibits in true HTML? What we're going to show you now, and I want to thank Gordon Ruchteshel, one of my coworkers who's on this call, for creating this chart, the current NCSR layout versus what you'll see moving forward. And I do not see the chart. So there we go. Thank you. It's animated. So if you look at the current layout and where information is currently coming from, you have the NCSR cover, you have your item 1, which is a series of reports, whether it's a single report or multiple reports, and current items 2 through 13. Signature page and exhibits. When you look at the future state, and Michelle, if you can fully animate this page, this slide, when you look at the future state, you could see that portions of what was item 1 and is now going to be used in the TSRs, as well as in items 7A and 7B and items 8 to 11. So there's a change in the content, where it's being used, but ultimately a lot of what's being used today is going to be used in the future state of the NCSR. And one last animation, Michelle, just shows you that these elements are going to be needed in the TSR and XBRL tag. So I'm using that term interchangeably like Jacob did. And then the rest of the items that are part of the NCSR filing that do not need to be tagged, but do need to be included in the XBRL file. A lot to consider. So moving on, and I'm trying to go a little quickly because we did run a little long today. So moving on, so there's a couple more pieces of animation. Items 7 to 11, which, as most of you know, are required on the website. So there is a web hosting component that I'll talk about in a moment. So what's the impact on your production timeline? Depending on your workflow, there's definitely going to be additional time required for your XBRL, whether it's review or the tagging. The review of the content as well as the taxonomy elements. We talked about there's multiple taxonomies going to be used within the tagging of the NCSR. The additional complexity brought on by what we just talked about in the NCSR. As importantly, Jacob alluded to it, there's resources out there to provide these services for you, understanding multiple taxonomies. In the days of risk return, it was simple. There was a simple taxonomy, 225 elements, there was no crossover. In pretty much most 40 Act filings today, you're going to see a crossover of taxonomies within a document to be tagged. That's the case here as well. And then what are the required outputs? So you have the entire NCSR for SEC filing. We've talked about that. But then you need to extract the items 7 to 11 to be placed on the fund website. That is one of the new requirements. Jacob talked about it with the layered disclosure. If you think of summary prospectus for mutual funds and the layered disclosure framework that was introduced, where the summary prospectus was the summary document and the statutory prospectus was the more detailed document, along with the SAI, where more detailed information can be found on a website, the same application can be seen here with the TSRs being the summary documents and items 7 to 11 being the more detailed disclosure. What are the deadlines we're looking at? When you look at the transition away from 30E3, where a 30E3 notice could have been mailed by day 70, there was 10 additional days to get the mailing done. We are back to a traditional 60-day workflow where the mailing needs to commence. And even though that's not technically the way it's written in rules, the mailing needs to commence within 60 days. Web posting needs to be done by day 60 as well. So the TSRs in item 7 to 11 need to be on a website by day 60, but the NCSR filing can take place by day 70. So when you look at your workflow and you think about those deadlines, the question that I ask all the time, and I get varying answers, is do you have a company policy about posting anything on a website that has not filed with the SEC? So if you're going to file by day 70, but you have to post by day 60, what's the impact internally? How does that impact your deadlines and your calendar? And does it move up your NCSR filings potentially? So what's changed besides a lot? I think the first one, which is unique, is fund administrator involvement. Fund administrators who are very good at what they do. The scope of services has changed with TSRs. We've seen it with MPORT and NSEN, but we're seeing it more on the TSR level than we have with any other traditional document type. XBRL is now required. Multiple sources of content for output and assembly. We talked a little bit about where that content is coming from. Some could be coming from a fund administrator. Some could be coming from the fund company directly. All that needs to be put together. Some needs to be tagged. Some just needs to be part of the assembly. And then the creation of multiple required outputs. So the TSRs need to be created at the share class level, as you all know, for print and mail purposes, and Jacob talked about that as well. The complete NCSR is needed for filing, but only items 7 to 11 for web hosting. So what you want is you want a dynamic process that can extract content for the end use. So if you need the entire NCSR, you have the entire NCSR, but what you don't want to do is you don't want to have to recreate the data for items 7 to 11. So you want a dynamic creation of those items where a platform can support that. And we talked a little bit about this, the web hosting requirement with the layered disclosure framework and an additional document type being required on the website of items 7 to 11 out of your NCSR. So there's a lot there. I went through it relatively quickly in the essence of time. We'll have some questions, I'm sure, at the end. But what I want to do now is turn it over to Mike Boyle for a quick presentation. And maybe not so quick.
Yeah, no, I was going to say quick indeed, as we still have Nikki and one or two other items following me. But thank you, Guy, Scott, and Jacob. That was fantastic. I've actually got 3 small pages of notes I took while you guys were speaking. So what I am going to cover, I don't have much of a slide here because we're going to do this live. But we're basically going to focus for you folks who are brand new to XBRL, give you a look at what you're going to see when you review, how to navigate the viewer, how to search, filter. There have been a couple of mentions of hidden facts, so we will look at that. And then we're also going to provide some additional links. So with that, let me move over to here. So, okay, for those of you who are brand new to XBRL, when you first open your document to review it, this is what you're going to see. Basically, an HTML page with orange.
Mike?
Yes.
Mike, you need to share your screen.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. Thank you. All right, thank you, Michelle. All right, so again, when you first go into your iXBRL document, this is what you're going to see. It looks like a typical HTML filing, but you will see certain items are underlined in orange. And what those are is what Scott referenced earlier. Those are tagged facts. So what does that mean? Well, let's click on one. Let's click on this 25. And then what you see pops up over here is the attribute dialog box. And this gives you all of the attributes which make up a fact, that being the tag, which is applied, expenses paid amount in this case, the fact value, which is 25, the period, this is for 6 months ended 4/30/2032, and then information telling you which class this is. Now, there's also been mention of single TSR filings and multiple TSR filings. And the SEC has provided 4 samples for vendors and registrants to look at. And one of them is the one we're looking at now. And the reason we chose this one is because this has 2 classes in it. Those classes being here, fake. Okay, and then if we go down to our second one, faker. So this is an example of a 1 series 2 class TSR. You can see the series is fictitious income ETF for both the second one and for the first one. But there are 2 different classes in there. So when you get in here, a couple of things to note. Over on the top right, you see where it says facts, and it currently says 206. Those are the number of tagged facts in the job. So if you were to go through, 1, 2, 3, okay? How do you filter them? Well, let's say you're only interested, or your particular responsibility was to review the broad-based indexes. So you could come under more filters, click on axes, and keep an eye over on the facts panel on the right. Click on broad-based indexes. You can see now that 206 has changed to 30. So if we click on 30 and click on one of these facts, it does a couple of things. It brings that particular fact right to the top of the screen, and it automatically pops open your attribute dialog box. So what this did, when it changed that list to 30, those are all of the facts that have to do with the broad-based index. Okay, so you can do that. You can then reset your filter. It goes back to 206. And maybe what you want to look at is something different, right? You only want to see one of the 2 classes. So if we just click on this first one, 51, you can see the total number of facts changed to 78. So those are just the facts that relate to the first class, which is fake. So there are a number of ways to filter on the data, depending on what your responsibility is. And keep in mind, after you do that, you always want to reset your filter, get back to 206. There has also been mention of hidden tags. So if we go to data, click on that. Hidden tags in the IX Bureau viewer are known as additional items. So if we click on this, you will see that changes to, let me make sure I've reset my filter, additional items 2. Now, you're looking at additional items or hidden items when you see this A over on the right. And probably the most common hidden item is this, your CIK. Why is that? Well, the CIK is not something that appears in your HTML file, but it is something that has to be tagged. And that's really the essence of a hidden tag. It has to be included, but it does not need, or it shouldn't be visible in your filing. Another example of that would be in your charts. So if we take this, this first line graph and we go down a little further, what the SEC did, which is very helpful, is they laid out those plot points here where they're visible. And they put a note here saying these tables would normally be hidden. They contain the data points for the image above. So all this tagging is for that line graph. Okay, so if we click on one of these, this is how it's going to look. The only difference being in a live job, it would have the A next to it because it would be a hidden fact. You're not going to show them again here because they're already accounted for in your line graph. A couple of things that were discussed earlier, and one was a question or there was a comment about taxonomies. So we are going to be using 3 different taxonomies here, one being the DEI. That stands for Document and Entity Information. Most of these are on your registration cover. This is common to all filings. Second one, of course, for TSRs is the OEF taxonomy. And you can see the vast majority of your facts, 193, are tagged with the OEF taxonomy. Now, another question was asked regarding US GAAP. Whoops. And if we search here, you will see there are also 4 US GAAP tags included. And I think Jacob kind of alluded to this. And I think what the SEC is doing is saying, okay, if there's a tag required, such as there is here, net assets, there's no need for us to create that tag in the OEF taxonomy because it already exists in the GAAP taxonomy. So they are pulling some tags in which exist in other taxonomies in order to avoid duplication. And I think you're going to see more of this as the months and years go by. So there's that. Another question about that was if we look here. So you can see this fact here, corporate high yield. This uses the investment type axis, right? Because we're over here in a breakdown of the assets. So again, the SEC is saying, all right, this already exists. Use the investment type axis from the US GAAP taxonomy. And a question was asked, if you create this and not use the existing one from the GAAP taxonomy, will it cause an error? And the answer is yes, because the SEC is going to say, wait a minute, you didn't need to create a custom axis here because it already exists. So you'll see there's a number of facts throughout the TSR where that is applicable. Guy mentioned something regarding the registration cover, that with TPAs involved here, you may have to assemble a cover from one location with the existing TSRs. If we have time during the Q&A, we may get into that a little more. In terms of navigating, a little more on navigating, you could go old school and say, all right, just work your way down, click on your facts, review them. Okay, that's one way to navigate. Another way is over here on your fact panel on the right, you can just move, you can click next, and it will take you through each fact in the job. And again, depending what your responsibility is in reviewing, you probably don't want to or don't need to go through every fact. And again, that's where you might want to consider filters, right? If your responsibility is just to review any particular part of the document. Michelle, I don't know how we're doing on time, but I think we probably have to transition to Nikki at this point.
Yeah, I think we need to take some CPE questions, and then we're going to transition to Nikki because we need to end on time.
Okay.
But thank you so much, Mike. That was great. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And Let's see, here we go. All right, and we're going to start with 2 more CPE questions. So I'm going to ask my colleague to help me bring up the CPE questions. Okay, so question 4. What content needs to be XBRL tagged in the NCSR filing to be in compliance with the rule? Is it the entire NCSR? Is it TSRs only? Or is it the NCR cover and TSRs? Which is the appropriate answer to the question? What content needs to be XBRL tagged in the NCSR filing to be in compliance? We've got about another 20 seconds here. Okay, just about another 15 seconds. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and close down this poll. And the correct answer is the NCSR cover and TSRs. Now we're going to go to one more poll question before I turn it over to Nikki. So in XBRL, the underlying data points in EDGAR filings for images of charts and graphs are called what? Are called an excerpt, a dimension, or hidden? Okay, about another 30 seconds here. Are they an excerpt, a dimension, or are they called hidden? Okay, just about another 10 seconds. All right, and we're going to close down this poll now. And the correct answer is hidden. So thank you very much for responding to the polls. I'm going to turn it over to Nikki Berteau. And Nikki, I believe you are going to share your screen now, correct?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so I'm stopping sharing and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Okay, so thank you very much, Michelle. I'm going to try to make this pretty quick. All right, so we are going to we're going to dive into a bit of the document mapping. Today, I'm going to show you some tagging samples for the tailored shareholder reports. And my goal in this section is to provide you a practical sample of your XBRL tagging. And then I'm also going to share with you an XBRL review checklist highlighting some of the top 10 items we recommend reviewing prior to filing your XBRL submission with the SEC. So here, I'm just going to scroll through these really quick, and then I'm going to jump into our application to give you a real live tagging view. But this is a document map. So it's really just outlining the structure and key elements that require tagging. It's really essential that that each section of your report is accurately tagged so that you comply with all of the SEC requirements. So this document, as I scroll through, it'll really provide you with a desk reference to assist you in your XBRL tagging efforts and your review. So pay attention to how sections are broken down, which will help in identifying the specific content and elements that require tagging. So leverage this as a desk reference. I'm going to jump into our application to quickly provide a live real-time view into a tagged consolidated shareholder report. So just give me 1 second here. Okay, so I'm going to, I believe you should be able to still see my screen. So I am going to show you. So I'm going to launch into a consolidated XBRL proof. Okay, launch into an consolidated XBRL proof. All right, so here my starting point is really just the interactive viewer. So here you'll see the form NCSR cover page. And here is really the facts, really just the facts disclosed that are being tagged and the elements that are being tagged. So I'm going to just scroll through these or select each one of these so you can see. Here's the consolidated shareholder report. We have the cover page and then each shareholder by class tagged. So we can see in this interactive viewer, we have all of our content tagged by share class, including our cover page. And you'll see all of your graphs are rendering, and you can see them tagged inside of your interactive viewer content. So you want to just make sure that you can also leverage this interactive viewer section here to kind of get a more holistic view of just your tagging context, right? What's tagged, what elements are applied to those tags. And then I'm just going to jump into the details section so that you can just see what this looks like. It's kind of, it will aid in your review, so you can easily review some of this content. So that was your line graph. This is your average annual return, and then your holdings. Okay, so now I'm going to launch into the AREL view. Okay, so here you'll see the rendering of your report. So here you can see the cover page is tagged. We have our document type tagged with the form NCSR, our registrant name tagged, and we have our date, document period end date tagged. So these, in your cover page, there are certain facts that should be tagged in line, and there's certain facts that can be tagged, what we'll call hidden, as Mike mentioned earlier. So we want to make sure you just keep cognizant of what is considered a hidden fact. In your cover page, we should expect to see certain facts being tagged in line, which I'm going to go over very quickly next. So I'm just going to scroll through this report. This kind of gives you a live view of real-time view of what a report, a sample report will look like, tagged in completeness. And you can see we have by share class. So here's sample A fund tagged. And then sample B fund tagged. And sample C fund tagged. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is, and just being conscious of time, I'm going to jump into back into the...
Nikki, your screen just went out. I think you need to share screen again.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Michelle. Hold on 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to jump to the end here. So just want to talk about this XBRL checklist. It's a pretty important point that I don't want to miss. So ultimately, you want to make sure that you are reviewing your XBRL tagging. So first, it's important to review the cover page tagging. Make sure you confirm the appropriate elements are tagged in line. That's the document type, the registrant name, the document period and date. Those 4 elements should be in line. And then you have facts that can be hidden, like the amendment flag, amendment description, the CIK, and the investment company type. These wouldn't be presented in your document, but they are required to be tagged as part of your cover page. Next, review your context dates. You want to ensure that all your facts are tagged with a context date that is consistent with the period of report. Also, each share class, given each share class has its own shareholder report, all these facts must be reported, must be dimensionally tagged with the appropriate class axes and class member. Also, confirm your iXBRL is tagged, iXBRL tagged has at least 4 statistics. So that's like your assets net, your holdings count, your portfolio turnover, your advisory fees paid. And this is per item 27A, section E. And any additional statistics disclosed should also be tagged, but you can use the additional fund statistics text block element to tag it just as a text block. Next, regarding your disclosures on holdings by geographic region, custom members should not be created on the geographic region axes. So filers should be using the extensive library of standard member elements instead of defining custom members. Remember, as Jacob mentioned earlier, data quality is key. So be mindful of custom tag usage. Custom tags should only be created if a standard member element or element does not exist. As I demonstrated earlier, check to ensure the interactive viewer renders all your graphs consistent with the report. Then perform and document a completeness check. It's critical that you review the XBRL submission to ensure that all of your relevant facts are tagged and tagged correctly. Also, review your hidden facts. Understand why they are hidden and not tagged inline. It's perfectly okay for some of these to be hidden. Then review your inline XBRL or your XHTML document compared to your PDF proof. There can and will be some minor formatting or style differences between the 2 documents, as one is XHTML and one is a PDF, but make sure that you review the inline or the XHTML to ensure you're comfortable with any of these minor style inconsistencies. And then lastly, review, document, track your REL validation results and your Edgar test filing results. Very important that you keep track of those results. Really one of the most important things you want to do overall here is you really should consider iXBRL early and often. It shouldn't be an afterthought. You could run into issues if you leave iXBRL review until the end. You don't want to wait until the end to review potentially hundreds of documents with only 10 calendar days after distribution. So consider during composition of your document. Consider the iXBRL during composition of your document. So review your iXBRL early and during composition. Try your best really to not wait until the end. Okay. And with that, following these guidelines and thoroughly reviewing each section, you'll ensure your reports are compliant and accurately reflect your disclosures. So that concludes my section. I'll turn it back over to you, Michelle.
Nikki, thank you very much. Yeah, before we go to questions, we'll try to get to 1 or 2 questions at the end, but we need to do our last CPE question. So I'm going to ask my colleague to bring up the final CPE question. And thank you everybody for hanging in there with us. We obviously have a lot of content to cover and we're very excited about the program put together here. So here's the last CPE question. Okay, given that each share class will have its own shareholder report, all facts reported in the TSR must be dimensionally tagged with which of the following: the DEI entity central index key element, the DEI trading symbol element, or the appropriate class axis and class member. which of those is the most appropriate answer. Okay, I've got about another 30 seconds here before we shut this one down. Okay, about another 10 seconds. Okay, we're going to shut this poll down now. And the correct answer was the appropriate class access and class member. So thank you very much for responding to our poll questions and for joining us today. We have gotten a lot of questions, and I think a lot of the team on the call here has been responding to those questions fast and furious, so I appreciate that. For those people whose questions we did not get to, we will try to respond back online. If you did post as anonymous, just send me an email and let me know who you are, and we'll respond to your specific questions. We're happy to do that. I'm going to turn it over to Josh, and maybe if everybody wants to bring up their cameras and go back online, and I'll let Josh close us out.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. First off, thank you to all the speakers today. Very informative. Big thank you to Michelle and XBRL US for bringing all this together. Couldn't have done it without you, so great job. We hope you guys enjoyed the session today. If you guys have a few minutes and you want to stick around, we do have just one general kind of question for the rest of the panelists. So I'll give it to you guys. Nikki, we'll start with you. So what's your final thought on the rule or anything else that you would want people to take away from today?
Well, I'm gonna reiterate the importance of data quality. It's really critical that we review our content, make sure that we're tagging facts correctly, make sure that, as I kind of mentioned towards the end, make sure that you are reviewing your XBRL early and often. Don't wait until the end. Don't wait until after distribution. You should be reviewing your XBRL during composition, right? I think that's it.
Great, thanks.
Thank
Guy,
you.
how about yourself?
Well, just bringing it back to the workflow conversation, be ready, understand the process, understand who's doing what and what has to be done. Test, create samples, test file, be ready. We know the May 31st cycle may not be the busiest, but the June 30 cycle right behind it will be. So just be ready.
Thank you. Mike, off to you.
Yeah, I would say in terms of reviewing your XBRL, if today was your first look at the viewer, don't be overwhelmed by it. It's very intuitive. Once you get in there 2 or 3 times and you get a feel for how to navigate, what the different filters do, it's a very quick study. So don't let it overwhelm you. You have a lot of support, certainly from all the vendors on this call, and maybe even other folks in your organization who've dealt with XBRL as part of CEF or risk return. So, just dive into it, and it's very intuitive.
Thanks, Mike. Scott, how about yourself?
Well, I would get involved early. The second part is I'd look at your workflow, look at which service providers you're using, and make sure that if you're combining instances together, that you're going to be able to do that technically. We don't actually do service, we do software. And that is a question that comes up quite frequently from funds is I have these 5 different instances, how am I going to combine them together? So think about that when you've got different parts of the document that may be being done by different folks. So I would review the entire work process early and then do some dry runs and make sure you do test filings well in advance of your first filings. Once it becomes something that's regular, it's not going to be that big of a deal. But for the first ones, don't just get caught in a rush on the last day when you're heading up against the deadline and things aren't working. So that's my advice.
Jacob, you want the last word here?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I'm gonna do 2 quick points. One is communication, like that's critical, and so making sure that you're consistent. So even internally consistent, because that kind of stuff could be detected pretty quickly. And then on Nikki's point on data quality, I will say that that's a focus of us. And so we do have a whole program that reviews annual reports, and what we've been folding in is XBRL tagging. And so you start to see some comments that we're issuing around incorrect tagging, not using the standardized taxonomy, and you may see that more as kind of our renewed focus, because ultimately our goal is to make sure that folks are tagging appropriately, that we're really focused on data quality, because like we're all using that data. And so we want to make sure that, to Nikki's point, is that it's filed correctly. And so we'll, it's definitely going to be an area for us, and you see that now, but it's probably going to be a renewed focus as these TSRs come through.
I'm just going to add on to that. I'm not going to, can't make any promises about it, but as a member of the Data Quality Committee, there have been some things that we have added on as TQC items. They're not official, but they can help also with checking certain things. For TSR, we have not done that, but it may come up.
Right. Well, thanks again, everyone, and thank you for everyone for attending. We'll close it out here and have a great rest of your week. These materials will be made public by Michelle here as well, so no fear on that. So, all right. Well, thanks again. Yeah, everyone take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.